Then there is the economic argument in favor and against property. The argument in favor of property holds that it is the most efficient means of producing wealth. Whereas the opponents argue that economic activity driven by the pursuit of profit, private gain, leads to wasteful competition. That's certainly true of the Marxists. And finally, you have the psychological defense of property and of opposition to property. The psychological defense of property maintains that ownership enhances an individual's sense of identity and self-esteem. Others argue that it corrupts the personality by infecting it with greed. So you now have basically four approaches to property, but fundamentally it pits the moral approach, which is hostile or critical of property, against the pragmatic one, which says it works, it enhances wealth, it protects people from the government, and so on. Now, in the Western world, you had already in the 8th century the idea that there was once a golden age when there was no private property, when everything was owned in common. This, of course, is particularly prominent in Plato, who argued in his writings, The Republic and the Laws, that property infects people with greed, and he wanted to go to extreme lengths. He wanted not only that wealth be owned jointly, but also families. Wives and children should be jointly owned. That was very exceptional. Aristotle, his pupil, was much more sensible, it seems to me, when he said this will not work, that people want to hold on to their properties and so on. Aristotle was for property and Plato was against property. But in fact, we cannot find a golden age when everything was held in common and there was no private property. What astonished me when I wrote this book, when I worked on this book, was how prevalent private property is among animals. All animals have a very strong sense of ownership. There's something called the territorial imperative. The first studies of that began with birds. An English ornithologist, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, noticed that birds who are very cooperative and very friendly to each other all the year long, when the time comes to breed, to build nests and to produce offspring, become very aggressive. That they occupy trees and fight off anybody who wants to approach. And then this was extended to other animals, and they found that indeed all animals have a strong sense of possession. Deer, for example, when male deer fight for possession of a female deer, they're not fighting just for possession of the deer, they're fighting for possession of the territory where their offspring will be able to survive. And the females are attracted to the stronger male because he can assure their children of survival. I understand that even amoebas have a territorial sense, that they will not allow others to encroach upon their territory. Now, our children are very possessive. The word mind is one of the earliest words they learn. Studies have been done of nurseries, very, very detailed studies, and the scholars who conducted them found that if there was a parallel between children, and I'm talking about kindergarten children, 4 or 5 years old, they would come and try to find out what it was over. It was always a possession of things. Dolls, paper, pens, whatever, and that the possession or the desire to possess is innate, whereas the desire to share has to be taught. So in Israel, they have, of course, they had, I don't know how many of them have survived, that communistic kibbutzim, where they found that the personality of the children attending, growing up in this kibbutzim, were very different from the personality of children who were brought up in a property society, and not always to their advantage. I'd like to cite to you a passage from William James's Psychology on the importance of ownership, because he ties it to psychology. The empirical self of each of us is all that he is tempted to call by the name of me. But it is here that between what a man calls me and what he simply calls mine, the line is difficult to draw. We feel and act about certain things that are ours very much as we feel and act about ourselves. Our fame, our children, the work of our hands may be as dear to us as our bodies are, and arouse the same feelings and the same acts of reprisal if attacked. And this is underlined in this book. In its widest possible sense, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his. Not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house, his wife and his children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses, and his bank account. All these things give him the same emotions. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle or die away, he feels cast down. An instinctive impulse drives us to collect property, and the collections thus made become of different degrees of intimacy part of our empirical self. In every case, the loss of possessions, there remains a sense of shrinkage of our personality, a partial conversion of ourselves to nothingness. I don't know whether modern psychologists will agree with this, but I find it very persuasive, both from private observation and from what my reading. I don't know, shall I ask people to interrupt if they feel they want to say something, or shall we wait till I'm finished?
If you would prefer to have people interrupt, but my recommendation would be, why don't you wait until we go ahead and complete your presentation. We'll ask questions then.
As far as I've been able to determine, there was no property in land. I mean, when we talk about property before modern times, we're talking about industrial property or about capital, we're talking about land, because that's how people live. Modern agriculture started about 10,000 years ago, and since then, possession of land and property ownership of land was the most important economic factor. I could not find any evidence that there was private property in land in either Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, the oldest ancient civilization. All the land in these two countries belonged either to the crown or to the temples. I think that it first emerges conditionally in ancient Israel. There's this wonderful story of King Ahab, who wanted the land which belonged to one of his subjects named Naboth. He wanted to buy it, and Naboth would not sell. So he wanted to exchange it, and Naboth would not exchange it. And finally, he listened to his wife, the notorious Jezebel, who said, just confiscate it, grab it. And he did. And God warned Ahab, if you pay a very dear price for that. And in Israel, you definitely did have, you had stone markers separating properties. You had a rule which nobody knows whether it was really obeyed in practice, the so-called Jubilee year, that if you sold a piece of land, then 7 times 7, that is 49 years afterwards, is reverted to you. And of course we have the commandments. Thou shalt not steal, never covet properties of your neighbors, and so on. But definitely we have private property in land in Greece. You could not be an Athenian citizen without owning land. Only landowners became citizens. Conversely, people who were not citizens could not own land. And I cite some passages in my book from Greek sources explaining how they speculated in that, and so on. So that was fairly well established. Now, the Roman contribution was that they developed, of course, a very elaborate system of land law. The land in the Italian peninsula under the Romans was held in private ownership, and